Hi, good afternoon. I really enjoyed the presentation earlier about animals because I'm here to tell a story about my cat and how he helped to build an education. But first, let's ask ourselves, what does it mean to educate? Merriam-Webster offers the definition to train by formal instruction. And this seems to be the definition that's most commonly applied in our traditional school setting. Our traditional school setting was modeled after a factory model. So you put raw materials in, that would be children, perform consistent, repeated actions, standardized lesson plans, and your finished product, trained workers, roll right off the assembly line. I spent a few years teaching in a traditional school setting, and by the middle of August, I could tell you what page of what textbook we would be on in the middle of March. I knew which drills we would be using to brush up on which skills. I knew that in the second week of September, we would be segmenting the word cat, and in the third week of October, we would be reading How Harvey Found His Missing Glasses. And then I met the children. They were creative and intuitive. Their interests were incredibly varied. I had one class who in 1 week taught me more about lowrider cars than I have learned in my entire life. And the visions I had for the curriculum we could design about lowrider cars. We could explore history, the invention and evolution of the automobile, science and engineering, the makings and mechanics of the internal combustion engine, math, calculating racing speeds and fuel efficiency, art, designing your own dream car, and of course, the underlying foundation of literacy required to complete this research. And those visions were shattered when the administration demanded that I stick to the pre-mandated curriculum. Funny enough, the children's interests did not expand to how Harvey found his missing glasses. By the end, the children and I had very high anxiety levels. Try as we might, we could not make reality match the curriculum's projected end goals. Let's take a look at another Merriam-Webster definition for education. To develop mentally, morally, or aesthetically. Education shapes our future generations. Rather than training children to repeat expected answers, we want to cultivate their inherent amazement, wonder, creativity, and intelligence. Meet David and Frances Hawkins, Boulder-based educational philosophers. Frances was a teacher, and David was a physicist. And he worked as the historian on the Manhattan Project, an experience which left him so disturbed by its destruction that he rededicated his life. Together, David and Frances worked to reignite the passion for learning in education. They founded the Mountain View Center for Education, for Environmental Education, a place where teachers could go to immerse themselves in the theory and practice, and all with the understanding that the joy of teaching comes from the never-ending act of being a learner. They inspired schools, museums, and educators from around the globe, including Loris Malaguzzi, founder of the Schools of Reggio Emilia, Italy. I teach at Boulder Journey School, which is inspired by the Hawkins work, and we partner with the Hawkins Centers of Learning. And we were fortunate enough to receive all of David and Frances's artifacts and personal mementos, which we use as a source for our philosophical inspiration. So with that weight behind me, what does that philosophy look like to me? One day last year, a 5-year-old boy brought in this book. It was the loudest, least educational book of TV characters you could imagine. And my teaching just stopped. This book was all the children wanted to look at, think about, talk about. In a traditional school setting, I would have put on my teacher voice and I would have said, put that book away until school is over. But then I realized that book gripped their attention far more than anything I could offer at that moment. Hawkins talked about the idea of eoliths, which were Stone Age tools that were shaped by nature and then used as found. And he spoke of their place in the classroom. Rather than going out and finding watered-down subject material and prepackaged resources, we can use the resources that are already in place. So my co-teachers and I asked ourselves if we could look at that book as an ally. We began to ask the children questions about it, provoking them to go deeper into the stories and the characters. And they began by strengthening their visual literacy, drawing characters, really, really cool ones, with powers that were unlike any traditional superhero I'd seen before. Next, they had to work on their narrative literacy because they wanted to really develop stories about them. And in order to tell a good story, you have to figure out what makes a story exciting. As Lily, age 4, so eloquently put it, first there's a good part, then there's a bad part, then the problem gets fixed. Next, they were testing their ethical literacy. They were asking questions like, if my bad guy fights a good guy because he thinks it's a bad guy, does that make him a good guy or a bad guy? These are questions I'm still asking. Well, as they were working, one story arc became prevalent, and the scene was set in a desert canyon, which is not exactly local terrain for Boulder, Colorado. So in order to make their story authentic, they had to go and do research to find out what makes a desert canyon a desert canyon. Then, hearing their stories was not enough. They wanted to act them out. This meant working on the mathematical concepts of size and scale, because how are you going to make your audience understand that you're set in a desert without a backdrop of a desert? At the end, we looked around and we realized an entire theater performance had been built. Sets were designed, dialogue written, characters developed. Because we had looked at this book, we had worked with the children's interests looking at this book instead of trying to counter them. This was all from one book that most people would not consider educational. But the story goes back even further than just the introduction of this book. By the time this book was even brought in, I had been with these children for 2.5 years. And in those 2.5 years, my time was dedicated to listening to, observing, and engaging with the children in their play. All the while, I was documenting the work they were doing through the use of photographs, artifacts, and note-taking of their conversations. We then used those documents, our own primary sources, if you will, to reflect with colleagues, families, and the children themselves. And one thing that we noticed was that as the children were playing, they were interspersing their work with storytelling. So wire became a roller coaster, and stones on a table became a path through a forest. Water in a sensory table became whitewater rapids, and hunks of clay became delicacies. Well, birthday cake mostly. And the children had the space to do this because we stepped back and allowed the time and space to mess about with materials. Hawkins called this messing about after what the river rat in The Wind in the Willows did, where he would just mess about in boats guided only by the flow of the river. The children could mess about with resources guided by the flow of their imagination. So, as we saw that storytelling was becoming such a big part of their work, I realized that storytelling is a big part of my life too. And as this was a common interest for us, I thought about what Hawkins said, that one of the very important factors in meeting and talking with children is that there be some third thing, which is of interest to the child and to the adult. So knowing that we all like to tell stories, and that we all really like my cat, I began to tell the children stories about the cat while we sat at the lunch table. Sometimes they were fantastical stories, sometimes they were silly stories, often they were thinly veiled recaps of our day at school, but it planted the seed that stories could be used to convey and communicate ideas and emotions. And so when that book came into our classroom, we were ready for it. I've started with a new class of toddlers now. These children do not narrate in quite the same way that my last class did. It's a completely different atmosphere in the room. I think if that book came into our classroom, I don't know that a theater performance would develop. I don't even know that that book would even come into our classroom with this group. As a new class, I don't know where we will end up. What I do have are resources to allow the children the space and time to develop their interests. We take the time, we offer the children experiences and resources in provocative arrangements, and then take the time to listen to the children's interactions and the space to watch their reactions. And through the interweaving of these resources, we are shaping our education. We don't need to go out and purchase standardized curricula and pre-written material. We already have everything we need. Thank you.